Please welcome Professor Stephen House.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak. It's really good to be here and see this movement that I've heard about. You know, when I was a student, there just wasn't this sort of thing around, and it's just fantastic to see how the ideas and the movement has developed. I was asked to talk about Australian aid. That was kind of the only instructions I was given, and I've got half an hour. So I'm going to give a pretty broad introduction to Australian aid. I'm going to talk about quantity and a little bit about quality, about the dollars, and then also about effectiveness. Please excuse my voice. I picked up a cold, and I had to start lecturing last week, and that really did my voice in. At the Development Policy Centre, we have created this website to give some basic facts and figures about the Australian Aid Program. And before I show you that, I'm actually just doing a bit of an advertisement, a bit of a plug. This is our blog, Dev Policy blog, that we run at the Development Policy Centre. And there's a lot of material about aid and development and different issues, like here whether we should have, it's a good idea to have laws for foreign aid. So if you're interested in aid and development, this is a really good blog to get information on, and I encourage you to sign up just to visit the blog and of course to contribute. So we have made this aid tracker as a user-friendly way to convey basic information about Australian aid. It's mainly about the size of the aid program, but we do have some information about the effectiveness of the aid program. So I'm going to use this to just, rather than reinvent the wheel, I'm going to use this to just show you what the trends have been in terms of Australian aid. I'm going to talk first about government aid and then about non-government aid. I mean, I understand you're mainly interested in non-government aid, but government aid is much bigger than non-government aid. And even the non-government aid sector gets almost half of its income from the government. So it's important to also understand the government aid sector. Yeah, so this is the graph we often talk about. This just shows the history of Australian aid since, basically since when we have data, which is the 70s. And it shows it both in current prices, so the actual value, that's the blue line, and then adjusting for inflation, which is the orange line. And we talk about the 3 eras of Australian aid. So for most of this period, so up to about the year 2003, we see aid sort of going up and down, but not doing very much once you take inflation out. Very modest increases in aid. This was a period when aid was really a backwater. There wasn't much policy attention given to it. It went up and down depending on who was in power and what the fiscal situation was, but with a very slow trend upwards. But it all changed around mid-2000s, and it changed under the Howard government, under the coalition government. And it changed for several reasons. It changed partly because of 9/11. It changed partly because of the MDGs. It changed partly because of a global trend. Everyone was increasing their aid in this time, and we wanted to keep up. And it changed because we had the resource boom, so we could afford to give more. And you can see that aid went up, and it doubled in nominal terms from $2 billion to $4 billion in 2010. That was the first scaling up commitment under the coalition government, and then Labor said, yes, well, we agree, and we're going to go further, and we're going to increase aid to 0.5% of GNI, which then was about $8 billion, and they would do that by 2015. And the coalition, then signed up, so we had these 2 bipartisan commitments to increase aid. Unfortunately, the second one, we never made it. And aid did continue to increase, and you can see it reached $5 billion in 2012-13. But the Labor government itself, while they made these very substantial increases to aid, pushed back the target. They didn't increase aid enough to meet the target. The fiscal situation got a lot tighter, and the coalition eventually walked away from that commitment. When the coalition were elected to government, they said they would just keep aid constant, keep it in line with inflation. But in fact, what they did was they had this massive cut in aid. So we've seen these huge cuts in aid over the last 2 to 3 years of about 1/3 once you take inflation into account. And what we're seeing now is that, as the promise is that aid is just going to keep in line with inflation, and Labor isn't really promising anything very different. So it's an interesting history. It's a somewhat sobering tale. I mean, aid is much bigger than it was certainly in 1970, even in 2000. But for whatever reason, we haven't been able to sustain that scale up that and the levels of generosity we once aspired to. As you probably know, we measure the generosity of aid, and some might say the generosity of a nation, by this ratio of aid to the size of the economy. Right? The bigger the economy, the more you can afford to give. And so this is an index of generosity, and this is the how we performed against that, and it's been on a fairly consistent negative trajectory until this period of the scale up, where we reversed that downward trend, and aid did increase. We never got to 0.5. The closest we got was 0.34, but that has now, that's now history. We're now at 0.25, and we're heading for 0.22. So our aid budget isn't at a record low, but our generosity as a nation is at a record low at the current time. There are lots of other graphs on this tracker that you can look at, but because my time is short, I'll just go on to non-government aid. So this is the aid that the Australian public donates to the non-government sector. It's just the funding they get from donations, so it doesn't include the very significant government grants they get. Although even this giving is supported by government, because nearly all of these donations will be tax deductible. And that tax deductibility is a cost to the government, and it's certainly a boost to the NGOs. So here you have a somewhat different story. We don't have the data going back for as long, because of course there's no, it's not like the government where you've got a centralised agency. Here you've got hundreds of NGOs. And it's only, fairly recently they've started reporting to ACFA, the peak body, how much they're raising. But we have data from the turn of the century. And you can see, well, let's start at the end. Now it's about $1 billion. It's about $1 billion. So it's about 1/4 of government aid is given by, from the public in terms of donations. Back at the turn of the century, it was only $250 million, or 400 million, adjusting for inflation. It was on an increasing trajectory in the early years of this century. And then there was this massive spike, which was the tsunami, the South and Southeast Asia tsunami that drew forth this enormous rush of giving from the Australian public, and basically doubling the amount people gave. There was something of a sort of bounce back, a reduction the next year, but nothing like back to base levels. So it was mainly a permanent shift, upward shift in giving. However, since then, while we haven't lost that gain, we haven't made a lot of gains either. And giving since then is more or less, it goes up and down. Of course, it depends what disasters are happening, but more or less kept in line with inflation. So it's interesting to speculate why. We're still sort of adjusting to our suddenly heightened level of generosity post the tsunami, or there's a feeling in Australia we're doing it tough with the end of the mining boom or increasing housing prices, or there's a reaction. There's a sort of charity fatigue, and there's a reaction to the number of requests that are being given, and I'll come to that in a minute. It's not a lot of money. I was just talking to someone about this at the break. So I'll just show, in terms of per capita terms, we donate about $40 per person a year to NGOs. So that's not a lot of money, really, when we like to think of ourselves as a generous nation. All right, that's the aid tracker. I'll now switch over to the slideshow. I've got a few more graphs about quantity, and then I'll just, at the end, say something about quality. I'm going to go back to government aid and then again to non-government aid, just to avoid going back and forth between these two. So going back first to government aid, I showed you how Australian aid was really being cut. It's important to understand that this is not sort of a global phenomenon. In fact, a lot of people thought that with the global financial crisis, we would see a real cut in OECD, that is developed country aid, but we haven't. In fact, aid is sort of at a record high now. It's quite, I think it's quite surprising. No one would have predicted that. You can see aid fell in the 1990s. That was the time of the Cold War ended. A lot of people thought that was the end of aid. But it took off again post 9/11 and with the MDGs, and it's continued through the global financial crisis. So Australia stands out. It's not the only nation that's cut its aid, but it's one of the few. And for us as a nation, that is a real challenge, because if we compare ourselves to other nations, we can use this index, the aid to GNI ratio, and we are now below that average. Right? We're the orange line, and this is the blue line is the global average. And you can see that in the past we've been just about always above the average, or if we've been below, it's only temporarily. Whereas now we're below, it looks like we're going to stay below. And this isn't the most recent data, because the global data always comes in with a lag. So even compared to other nations, we're showing less than average generosity. And there's been a lot of talk about budget repair and debt and deficits. And it would be one thing if aid was being cut as a overall, policy of fiscal austerity, but it's not. Overall, if we look at, of course, aid's a very small part of total government spending, it's only about 1%. But if we look at aid, it's been cut by this 30%, it's almost one third I mentioned earlier, whereas non-aid spending has gone up. This is compared to when the coalition came in. It's gone up, so this year in 2016-17, it's gone up by 10%, and it's scheduled to keep growing. Right? So that's after inflation. So overall, we're seeing government expanding in line with the economy, but aid not. And if you remember back to the 2014 budget, where there were a number of cuts proposed, very unpopular, but aid was one of them. It's one that went through. There's no legislation to protect aid in the Senate. And when you look at public opinion polls, it is the one cut that most of the public support. So it's important to bear in mind that there isn't a lot of public support for aid. And even when you tell people how little aid we're giving, that doesn't seem to change their mind. Go on to non-government aid now. And I showed you how that went up with the tsunami, and since then it's basically been flat. Who are the big NGOs who are getting this $1 billion? This shows the top 15, except for World Vision. World Vision is so big that if you put it in the graph, you wouldn't be able to see anyone else. World Vision, I think it's about 40% of total non-government aid. It is declining. So World Vision is losing market share, but it's still by far the dominant. After World Vision, it's Compassion. Compassion is, like World Vision, a sort of Christian evangelical, has a Christian evangelical base, but is more explicit, I think, about it. Perhaps more on the religious side. Anyway, it's been very successful in increasing its funds, and it is now actually the second biggest donor, the second biggest NGO. The third biggest is MSF. MSF has a sort of very simple, compelling message about doctors saving lives. That's been very successful. Oxfam is next in line. Then Fred Hollow's Child Fund. There's a whole range of these. I'm not sure exactly what you conclude from this, but I think the ones who are really growing either have a strong church base like Compassion, or they have a very simple message to sell, like MSF and Fred Hollow's. One of the concerns with the NGO sector, it's a very tough world out there, and I'm involved in a couple of NGOs myself, and I know just how difficult it is to fundraise. And while the total amount of funds received hasn't gone up, fundraising costs have gone up. That's the blue line, and you see they've gone up from 60 million, so more than 10 years ago, to over 140 million now. And so fundraising as a total proportion is also going up. It's not clear why that is, but clearly charities find having these people in shopping malls, so-called chuggers, that is the most effective way of raising funds for your particular charity, but it may create a sort of negative sentiment about charities in general. So it could be a kind of tragedy of the commons. We need to think more about how to increase funding overall for NGOs. There's a risk that we're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So now I want to say something about effectiveness. Of course, aid effectiveness is a massive issue, and I used to run, I'm not doing it right now, but I used to run a course on it. So it really takes many, many lectures to give fair treatment to issues around aid effectiveness. I'm just going to put up one slide here. I'm going to put up some aid policy assertions just to get you thinking about these issues. And I'm very happy to take questions or talk with you afterwards. I think I'm scheduling one of the afternoon sessions if people want to talk about this more. I mean, I put these as someone who is an aid supporter. I've worked in aid most of my life, and on balance, I think aid is a good thing. But I'm certainly not an uncritical supporter of foreign aid, government or private. And I put these remarks up, to provoke some discussion. These are, things that I would assert to be true based on my research and also my experience. They're probably not all things I can prove, but they're things I have a fair degree of confidence in. First, aid is many things. I mean, that's obvious. It's very tempting because we can measure aid in dollars just to talk about these quantities. But we have to understand underlying those quantities is a whole raft of activities of very different nature. And they range from your NGO, very small projects, to your mega government projects. And then the government projects themselves take on so many different shapes, right? Scholarships is a $100 million aid project. There are massive infrastructure projects. About 1/4 of our Australian aid is given as technical advisors. These are expert consultants, or at least we hope they're experts, who are paid, often paid very well, to live in developing countries and to advise governments. It's from that right to the other extreme, which is responding to a disaster. So it just makes it very difficult to generalize. And, I haven't put up anything here about aid works or aid doesn't work. I mean, it's very difficult to generalize about aid because it covers so many different types of activities and it's given by so many different sorts of donors. Probably the average effectiveness of Australian aid is higher than the average effectiveness of Saudi Arabian aid. I'd be pretty confident about that. But those sort of differences do make it difficult to generalize about aid effectiveness. Second, aid is a minor determinant of development outcomes. I'm not putting this up to belittle aid efforts. Obviously, I've spent most of my life working on aid. But I do think there is a risk that we overestimate the importance of aid. And for most countries, the key determinant as to whether they succeed and whether their people are lifted out of poverty and get a good education, good health, is the quality of their government. And if you have a good government, then over time they'll find out what works and policies will improve and outcomes will improve. So it's really, each country is to a large extent a master of their own destiny. So we do need to keep that in mind, have a certain humility when we think about our efforts, right? We just have to think about how small aid is in the grand scheme of things. It's much less than 1% of our income, and it's much less than 1% of the countries that receive it. Something that small is not going to change the destiny of nations. Third thing I think I've learned is that the quality, when we think about aid effectiveness, it's often out of our control. There's certainly a lot of things we can do, but the biggest determinant of aid effectiveness is the quality of recipient country institutions. If those institutions are working well, they can make very good use of these additional resources and of the additional ideas that come with those resources and are often the most important contribution. On the other hand, if those institutions are not working, if there's a lack of capacity, if there's a lot of corruption, take the extreme case, if there's a civil war, then a lot of that aid is not going to work as effectively. You could still do some things, and you shouldn't give up, but even things that we think of as relatively simple, like immunizations, distributing bed nets, they're still much harder in a weak recipient country institutional environment than in a strong institutional environment. Number 4, just to balance that, I would say the one thing we can do the most about, but which is still we find very difficult to act on, is this lack of accountability around aid. I think we've learned in economics it's not so much whether it's a market or a non-market mechanism, it's whether the consumers and the beneficiaries are able to provide feedback. If they can provide feedback, whether it's to a government or a market, they'll often get what they want. In aid, you've got funds from one country being spent in another country, and ultimately those people don't vote. They don't have influence in the country that's giving the aid. It's a long way away, and it's very hard to know what's going on. So that's a difficult issue that I think I learned from my first mission in the World Bank, or my second mission, where we had to write these back-to-office reports, and nothing that we'd agreed on in my first mission had been implemented. And I wrote that. I wrote nothing has been implemented since my first mission. But these back-to-office reports had to be cleared by our bosses before we were sent out. And he changed, nothing has been achieved, to less has been achieved than was expected. Which was the truth, but not the whole truth. And who was to know, apart from me, who dutifully changed the text? Number 5, the growing tragedy of aid is countries that need aid the most can make the least use of it. You know, again, this is not to be counsel of despair, but to be realistic. And I've come to learn this myself. In the last few years, I've gone from working on countries like Indonesia and India, where progress is difficult but possible, to working on countries like Papua New Guinea, where progress is extremely difficult, and where in some respects the country is literally going backwards. These are the countries that need aid most, but they find it very difficult to make use of it because of that point that their institutions are weak. Countries like India and Indonesia have made excellent use of aid. You know, if we think about the Green Revolution, probably the most successful aid intervention anywhere, but you know, to a large extent they've graduated from aid. And we are left with the most difficult countries that need help. So I think aid is getting more difficult rather than easier. Number 6, yeah, we are. You know, I'm sure you know the saying. You know, give a person a fish and they can eat for a day. Teach them how to fish, they can fish for a lifetime. So actually, I get the sense you people don't really believe that. You'd rather just give them the fish, which I find refreshing actually, because in the government aid world, this motto about teaching them to fish is very much alive and well, right? Capacity building is sort of the mantra of aid. We spend a lot of money trying to build capacity, trying to improve recipient country institutions, because it is correctly recognized that that is the most important thing for development. What is underestimated is just how difficult it is to teach a person how to fish, right? That is how difficult it is to improve government institutions. You know, you can have all the experts you want, but that doesn't change incentives that people face. So I think there's kind of skepticism I detect here towards those efforts is a healthy one. And finally, to end on a positive note, because this can seem like a bit of a downer, the best aid projects are long-term interventions. You know, I think if you're thinking about where to concentrate your own efforts, I encourage you to think long-term. The best projects that I've been involved in that I've seen over time are ones that have gone for 20 or 30 years. And you have, in that period, you can learn from your mistakes, you can be held accountable for your mistakes, and you can improve rather than giving up. Now, the most common criticism of a project is that it's not sustainable. And if you run a project for just 3 or 5 years, you know, it's not surprising that when you come back 5 years later, it's hard to find any traces of that project. So take a long-term view, and I think you'll get the best returns with foreign aid. Anyway, look, I'm sorry if that's all a bit glib. It's just to start the discussion. I'm happy to take questions or to talk with you afterwards. Thank you very much.